Hello and welcome to the EIC Clearly podcast. EIC Clearly? See what I did there? This is the podcast that brings you in-depth discussions with energy, policy and thought leaders on the most critical issues, trends and innovations shaping the global energy supply chain. So for today's EIC Clearly podcast, I'm delighted firstly to welcome Campbell Keir, who is president of EIC. And actually before EIC, he was also director for energy and infrastructure at the Department for International Trade. And he will be interviewing today Greg Hands, the Right Honourable Greg Hands, who had a long successful ministerial career, was also chairman of the Conservative Party, and his last Minister of State role was for trade policy in the Department for International Trade. So I'm really looking forward to hearing from Greg and from Campbell.
Well, it's great to be here, and I'm a big fan of the EIC, so looking forward to this.
Great, thanks. So I'm not going to go through your CV, because if people want to read in detail about what you've done in your life, they can go to the government website or to LinkedIn. That's quite comprehensive. But I'm going to pick out a few things. First of all, you were born in New York, moved to England when you were quite young, but you're an American-British citizen. Is that still true?
That is correct. I'm a dual citizen, which has got advantages and disadvantages.
Yeah, maybe from a tax point of view.
It definitely is.
Okay. After university, you worked as a trader in the city of London and New York.
Correct.
As a derivatives trader.
That's right.
Okay, it sounds very fancy to me. And then you became a member of parliament from 2005 onwards.
Yep.
And you did have some boundary changes. Since that, you've worked as a minister and a minister of state. And the difference is that a minister doesn't go to cabinet. Minister of State does.
Yeah, well, not quite. So a cabinet minister goes to cabinet. So I've been a cabinet minister twice. Ministers of state can attend cabinet, just to make it more complicated, and other ministers below definitely do not attend cabinet. So if you like, there's a middle sort of ranking minister, you might attend cabinet. But I attended cabinet twice under David Cameron and Rishi Sunak.
And you've been Minister of London, Chairman of the Conservative Party. You've been Minister of State for Trade Policy.
4 times.
Minister of State for Business, Energy and Clean Growth.
Yep.
You voted to stay in the EU.
I did.
You resigned from the government over Heathrow Airport expansion.
I did.
And you lost your seat in the recent 2024 election.
Correct. Very narrowly by only 152 votes, but it doesn't make a difference. I'm out.
That's democracy, isn't it, Greg?
Yeah.
So what made you give up a very successful business career as a trader to get into politics? What motivated you to do that?
Well, I think, Campbell, there's really 2 things. I mean, first of all, I'd always been quite interested in politics. So when I was at university, although I was studying history and languages, I was quite active in what would be called now student politics. So I was always interested in politics. But I think the 2 things that really drove me to get into it were experiences I had living abroad. The first was I was very, very lucky to live in West Berlin in the late 1980s by a bit of chance. And it was, of course, nobody knew the Berlin Wall was going to come down 4 years later, but experiencing Eastern Europe and experiencing what it meant to live in and be in a communist society, obviously not in West Berlin itself, but right next door. And that was quite a big influence on me. And the second thing was living in the United States in the 1990s. And I thought at that point that the UK could go quite a bit further into a free market direction, which I think the UK has since done. And I'm not sure the current state of play in the US is necessarily the model for the UK going forward. But I think at that point it was. And I thought the much more free market oriented way the US was going at that time was something the UK should emulate more. So I would say those were 2 kind of formative influences on me to then run for elected politics from 1998 back here in the UK.
And you certainly have an Eastern European focus, don't you? You speak Czech and German amongst the 5 languages that you cover. Do you have a strong interest in Eastern Europe?
I do. So it's all born out at that time living in West Berlin, where literally East Germany was a 40-minute tube ride away. And I'd done German at school, but really learned it very, very well living in Germany. as you know, makes a massive difference living in a country to learning the language.
Yeah.
So I went to East Germany a lot. I went to communist Czechoslovakia. I learned Czech and Slovak at university. I did a lot of things. I set up the first university exchange scheme between the UK and Czechoslovakia. In the summer of 1989, it was like the worst time to set it up because by the following year, it was already defunct. Nobody needed a formally organized university exchange scheme. But it was really kind of quite an interesting place to be, slightly by chance, but life is full of opportunities, and being in the right place at the right time is often very, very beneficial. That's when I was.
Yeah, I think that's part of my life experience as well. You're sometimes just in the right place at the right time when things are going on and kicking off, and you can perhaps then make a contribution in some small way or other. I mean, you're much more on the political side, I'm more on the business side, so that's interesting. So let's move on a little bit. I want to ask you, for the sake of our listeners, what it's like being an MP. We vote for you guys. You come into office, you sometimes get a ministerial job, sometimes you get a Secretary of State type of role. So what's it actually like, Greg? Is it as glamorous? Lunches, dinners, chauffeured around? What's it really like being a minister and perhaps a Secretary of State?
Well, I think it can be a bit of that, Campbell. I mean, there definitely are the glamorous sides of it. But there's also a lot of dealing with very specific problems, constituency surgeries, getting stopped in the street and being given an earful. I mean, actually, funny enough, I quite enjoyed it, which is probably a sign that you're the right person for the job if you don't mind that sort of thing. Sometimes it's a bit difficult when, people come to your family home and knock on the door and hand you over some documents or a petition or whatever. So, but I would say the best thing about being an MP, apart from having the calling to do something about a specific thing or to improve the country in general, is the variety in the role. I mean, literally, you'll be going from asking the Prime Minister a question at Prime Minister's Question Time to an hour later you are sitting down, you're visiting a local school. An hour after that, you're visiting a local business. If you're here as a sort of backbench MP, kind of trying to sort out a problem for them, trying to work out what's going on, to, then you're off to an awards ceremony. I mean, the variety is amazing, and that is generally quite advantageous. I think the only disadvantage, well, sometimes you can find it slightly overwhelming. I think some people who become MPs kind of realize this isn't quite the thing for them, as there's almost, if you like, too much variety in it. I think the ministerial side is also very interesting, but quite different as well, where really you are then becoming like the decision maker in a very specific area. You might be the decision maker for welfare reform, and you are deciding what level universal credit should be set for the coming year. And that is quite a different sort of skill set and a different operational aspect of that. But all of these people are still members of the House of Commons, MPs as well at the same time. So balancing those two things, again, adds to the variety of the role, adds to the challenge of the role. And you always feel, in my view, as if you're trying to do about 4 or 5 jobs, not as well as you'd like to do them.
Yeah, I think my experience is I've worked with you on a few occasions, and I'm always impressed how a minister arrives on day one and immediately he has to appear like the expert in that specific area.
Yeah.
And of course, you've got to be, I assume, very quick on the uptake in terms of you're given a brief, which can be short or long, and you have to be able to pick that up quickly. And, for example, if you're appearing on TV or something, you will be asked about your area, but you may well be asked on any area that's going.
Well, it is also being well briefed by a really good team. So every government department has got a really good team of people who know that subject inside out, and they will know how to brief their minister well, and a good minister will know how to be briefed and get briefed. So working with great officials, I think, is also important. I'm a big supporter of civil servants and the civil service in general. I think it's some really, really incredibly talented.
Yeah, that was my experience. A lot of very good civil servants. And I always liked ministers. You were one of those who actually listened to the brief.
I mean, that's the only way to really do the job. If you want to answer questions in the House of Commons on energy policy, you're not going to add any value if you don't know it yourself. So, yeah.
So before we move on, what are your top 3 takeaways about being a good minister? 3 things should an incoming or aspiring minister takeaway from your experience?
I would say is to realize that time is quite finite, and don't pretend that you're the person who's actually running the department. So I think you are the decision maker, and you are reliant on people to provide you good advice.
Like the perm-secs.
Like the perm-secs, and people are writing you advice. You definitely don't have to agree with it. And quite often I would not agree with it. And they would expect you not necessarily to agree with it, because you might have a sort of a political hat on and say, well, actually, I don't think the Prime Minister is going to want to go down this course. And so the first bit of advice I would give is to read the advice carefully, but do not feel the need to necessarily follow that advice. I'd also initiate things. Don't just be the person that, if you like, is the rubber stamp or the spokesman for the department. I'd work out, what are your priorities? You've got to make sure they're not inconsistent with the Prime Minister's priorities or anybody else. And then over time, you get the right balance there, I would say. There's a lot of people trying to take out bits of you and bits of your time to do all kinds of things, go on visits, go to international conferences, make speeches, answer debates in Parliament, select committees. And there's multiple people trying to take. So you've got to really be on top of managing your own time and get good people in around you.
I know the pressure on your diary when you were a minister. How do you manage your family life then? You just have to say, I'm going home at this time.
I think different ministers do it in different ways. I think one of the advantages I had as a London MP, so my constituency, Chelsea and Fulham, is next door to Westminster. So that makes life quite a bit easier. You don't have to manage two different households. Like if you're an MP and a government minister and your constituency is, for sake of argument, Carlisle, then you've got a whole set of additional challenges which weren't the case for me. So I was quite lucky, I think.
Yeah, one of your PMs was Rishi Sunak, and he's well up north, isn't he?
He is. The Prime Minister will typically not visit their own constituency as often, but if you're like a junior minister, particularly in a marginal constituency, you have to be there Friday, Saturday, Sunday every week. So I think it's one of these things you kind of find yourself in many ways sort of doing 4 or 5 things that you'd like to do better at each of them, put more time into each of them, but you just got to find a way of, there's corners that get cut, I'm afraid.
Yeah, and I think your final point, which you didn't mention, is listen to your excellent civil servants. Yes.
Well, I think so. You don't always have to agree with them, but they are, some of the best people in that field. They're not always right, and it's always good to get in some kind of external challenge. Don't only listen to other MPs and your officials. You need to meet with the industry, you need to meet with think tanks, you need to meet with anybody who's got a view. I mean, when I was energy minister, for example, you couldn't be energy minister just listening to people in the department or to other MPs. You had to go out to offshore wind farms, you had to go to Aberdeen, you had to go to meet your international counterparts.
So let's move on a little bit to the bigger issues of the day. The new president in the United States, Donald Trump, has come in with a bang and is making a lot of changes. So our members are keen on doing business, of course. And so while we look at the big picture and what might happen, let's see if we can tease out a little bit what it might mean for British business. So we have to start with Ukraine and Russia. You have a strong interest in Eastern Europe. Let's hope that we get a peace deal going. But what's your view on the whole situation?
I'm very, very concerned about it, Campbell. I think many people are trying to muddy the waters at the moment about what is actually going on. So let's remind ourselves what is happening there. And this is a naked aggression from Vladimir Putin, the likes of which we've not seen since World War II, in Europe at least. He just completely unprovoked invaded a sovereign neighboring country in a brutal manner, setting out deliberately to destroy a country, destroy a people, belittle a people, kidnap their children, sending in heavy weaponry to attack civilian areas. It is a disgrace what has happened there. We should never forget that. So if you hear anybody out there saying, on the one hand this, on the other this, 6 of one, half a dozen the other, the war between Russia and Ukraine, if anybody uses language like that, it's not the war between Russia and Ukraine, it is a naked invasion, aggression by Russia and Ukraine. So I'm worried that the way that any settlement might be moving is to have some kind of a ceasefire followed by a settlement which will basically reward the aggressor, in this case Russia. And I think rewarding the aggressor, as we've seen from our own history, there's so many parallels between what happened in Germany and Central Europe in the 1930s. I'm really not exaggerating. The Munich Agreement in 1938, which I spent a lot of my time as an undergraduate studying. In fact, my dissertation was on Sudeten Germans, which I'm going way off piste at the moment. But my point is that we shouldn't get away from the fact that this is what happened here is an appalling, unprovoked, naked aggression. And that is why I think the UK has done the right thing. Boris Johnson, not everybody's a fan of Boris, but he did absolutely the right thing from the very beginning to back Ukraine. I think the UK needs to remain the biggest large-scale supporter of Ukraine, because if it falls, then Putin will feel emboldened, others around the world will feel emboldened, that the West is not ready to stand up for smaller countries when they're facing an aggression like that. I think the consequence of that, different parts of Asia, other parts of Europe, not just in relation to Russia, but around the world.
So if we reward the aggressor, you think that will encourage other nations, we could think of China and Taiwan, for example, to make the same kind of old move because they know we're not going to respond?
I think it probably will. I mean, if you look back at recent history, I think Putin was emboldened by the West's failure to take action in Syria, for example. Thinking back to House of Commons votes 10 years ago, the US didn't take real action in Syria. I think all of these things lead to longer term consequences, where if people think that the forces of freedom in the world are not going to stand up and be counted, then the aggressor will push out even further. And I think the consequences of that, for example, Margaret Thatcher understood that perfectly well. The Falklands War, this is now going back, whatever it is, more than 40 years, wasn't just about Argentina and General Galtieri and all that stuff. It was about showing that aggression shouldn't pay. And I think the first Gulf War showed that aggression didn't pay, and therefore had a really important consequence for keeping the peace in the world for the 30 or so years after that. I think it's only recently, in the last 10 years, that the West has lost its way a bit. And anything that would appear to reward Russia for its aggression, like a territorial gain for Russia or a demilitarization of Ukraine or some kind of stipulation that Ukraine can or cannot do these different things, I think that would be wrong.
Okay, let's move on to an area that you're passionate and expert in, and that's trade and trade barriers and tariffs. These have long existed. And I think pre-COVID, we were moving into a fully free and open world. And I think COVID perhaps exposed some of the vulnerabilities of a free trade world. As a former trader and as a Minister of Trade, can trade tariffs help or hinder US revitalization of their industry, especially the Rust Belt areas, for example? And what does that mean for UK growth?
I mean, the first thing I would say is that the history, as somebody who studied history and languages, I always like to go back to the history. The history of tariffs is not a good one. So the last time the world went down the road of big-scale, comprehensive tariffs was in the 1930s. As a big part of the background to the Great Depression. So there's two guys called Senator Smoot and Mr. Hawley who proposed the 1930 Smoot-Hawley Tariffs Act in the United States. They started with Canada.
Goodness, going back in time, right?
And it was also done for two reasons, just as it is being done today. One, to bring industry back on shore, and secondly, as a revenue stream. And the US, at the early part of the 20th century, used to raise half of its revenue from tariffs, incredible though it may seem. But
this is what Donald Trump wants to do now.
I think he sees it as a revenue-raising measure, doesn't have to do so much on tax. Then when tariffs were half of the income tax hadn't even started, so it's a different world. I don't think you can go back to that world because that would mean, insufficient public services and everything else. Anyway, so I think the history of tariffs and then tipping the US very quickly into recession. You could argue that it was after the stock market crash of October 1929, but nonetheless, it was a big part of that depression. And tariffs might seem a populist thing, in inverted commas, let's make the foreigners pay, but it's actually...
I think that's a misapprehension in the States.
Totally.
They think that the people overseas are paying the tariffs.
Right.
It's not
it's the importer.
Consumer.
Yeah. You're 100% right. It's the importer who pays the tariff. Obviously, it does have an impact on the exporter back in China or the EU or the UK, wherever it may be, because they're going to export less of their product because it's become more expensive. But it is sort of a populist thing. Once it makes people poorer, one of the things about politics is, which is stating the obvious but needs to be continually restated, people don't vote for people who make them poorer. People vote for politicians who they think are going to make them better off.
I think that's why Donald Trump won, isn't it? It was the so-called pocketbook, the American version of the wallet, the pocketbook.
Absolutely. And they'd all been suffering under Biden or in the Biden years, and I'm not here to apportion blame, but living standards certainly had not gone up under Biden. And I think that the consequences, politically and economically, could be very severe. Supporters might say that Trump is just using these tariffs as a way to extract concessions, as a negotiating ploy. But nonetheless, once they do come in, then there's already comprehensive tariffs on China. We've got comprehensive tariffs on steel and aluminium. It will all add up, and it's all going to make prices more expensive. I don't think the US is going to onshore a lot of those jobs. So I think the consequence for the economy, for the US economy, then for the global economy, will be very negative. And last time around, going back to my history, 1930, the Republicans proposed this, Senator Smoot, and he lost his Senate seat 2 years later, the biggest swing in US Senate history in 1932, and the Republicans were out of the White House for 20 years. So my central feeling is that tariffs are a really bad idea economically and a bad consequences politically. So what should we do in the UK? I think actually...
Well, if you're a British businessman, how do you cope with this?
Well, I think the UK government is following the right course broadly. I just like them to see them getting on with it better. I mean, trying to essentially ride both horses. Trump doesn't have a particular beef with the UK because we don't have much of a trade surplus with the US.
No, we're in balance, roughly.
We're roughly in balance, yeah, depending on whose data you use. So he's not really targeting the UK, although we are subject, as of this week, to 25% on steel and aluminium, which is, in my view, completely crazy. But I think the UK is following the right course by trying to seek a deal with Trump, whilst also saying the UK is not going to follow down this road. The UK is going to remain an open, free trading country, and we're going to play by the global rules, which we, by the way, set up with the US back after World War II, even if our co-founders got AWOL. So I think the UK government need to get out there and negotiate this agreement with the US, and they need to be more active. I think in terms of a company, I think it's unlikely the UK will put in countermeasures. I think it's likely the UK and the US will come to an agreement that will avoid the UK having to do a lot of tariffs. I would also be thinking there might actually even be an opportunity there because my products might be cheaper relative to my competitor from, say, Europe or from Canada or everyone's competitor. There's actually hidden within all of this an opportunity. And secondly, I'd be thinking about, actually now is the time. If we're going to do this deal with the United States, what actually would you want to get out of a deal with the United States? Here is an opportunity. For example, if you go to the US a lot, it's much harder for British business people to get a visa to the US than for most other Western countries by a historic quirk. If you're an Australian business person, you get into the US pretty easily. But the UK has never really negotiated a visa deal. So I'd be thinking, hold on a minute, what would actually make my life easier for exporting or doing business in the US? The US is still our single largest trading partner. So I'd be thinking there might be some opportunities here for my business.
Our business leaders should be pressing their MP to go for that deal that we were promised post-Brexit of the US-UK trade deal.
I negotiated the first 6 rounds of that deal back in 2020, and actually it wasn't our fault the deal happened. It was ironically Trump losing that election, and Biden was simply not interested in any trade deals. I mean, Trump, for all his kind of eccentricities on trade, was much more interested in doing a UK trade deal than President Biden ever was. So that was an opportunity. But I'd also be thinking about what is it that would make my business relations with the United States, if that's important to you, what would make it easier? And actually not just think about the negative of tariffs. What is the opportunity? Maybe it's business visas, maybe it's professional qualifications. If you're a lawyer, for example, and you want to practice or do some of your law in the US, you face huge regulatory burdens. So removing those, that kind of thing I'd be thinking about.
And investing in the US in manufacturing, maybe shifting your manufacturing base to the States?
I wouldn't necessarily do that because if the UK does do a free trade agreement, it should probably get you around that. I think the UK will actually be a great place to manufacture from in the coming decades because the UK will have the best trade agreements of any country in the world. We are the only European country in the CPTPP free trade area, which covers currently about 15-16% of worldwide GDP. We have tariff-free, quota-free access to the European Union. It's not as easy as when we're in the single market. I agree with that. And we will have, I think, good access to the US if we do a good trade deal
I assume they could invest in the UK. I mean, we need investment in our infrastructure to achieve net zero, etc. So if we had a free trade deal, it could attract American investment in the UK.
I think it definitely would, Campbell. If you look at the US is our biggest investor into the UK. As you know, every day, more than 1 million Brits go to work for an American company, and the same works the other way. So I think the investment picture can continue to be very strong. Particularly as we know that Trump is quite fixated on trade deficits, trade surpluses, and the UK is in the fortunate position of being close to being in trade balance.
Okay. I mentioned briefly net zero. So we don't look like we're going to hit 1.5 by the end of the century. And some of the recent reports say that the government in the UK is not going to hit its interim targets. And it's clear from the EIC data that the traditional industry of oil and gas is attracting all the investments. The final investment rates for those industries is high, but for renewables, it's very low. What, in your view, has to change to really push the net zero agenda and help businesses? They want to go there, but the recent survey we did show they feel less optimistic about achieving these goals. So we have to do something to help them help themselves get on the net zero agenda. And that's really the supply chain, isn't it?
I think you're setting out the question quite well there, Campbell. I was Energy Minister 2021 to 2022. Not really long enough. We changed our ministers too often in the UK and still do, but going off on a side.
Our prime ministers, I seem to recall. There's a few prime ministers, haven't you?
Well, we have.
Was it 4?
We had 5. And I was the only minister to serve all 5, would you believe it? Would you believe it? So I've served more prime ministers than probably most people have done ever. But policy is evolving. I think the debate around net zero has moved in a slightly unfortunate way. Net zero has come under attack, and that I think is not right. Whatever your view about how you get there, I think it's good to have broad agreement that net zero is in itself a good thing for us to be doing, to become climate neutral. It's got so many other fortunate consequences for our environment, not just hitting a paper target, but if you think about, I'm digressing here a little bit, but how much London's air quality has improved over the last 30 years, it's been due to...
And water,
the elimination of use of coal. Actually, our environment in your and my adult lifetime has improved. Everybody likes to knock it that we're getting worse, but actually we've got a lot better. We need to continue down that road. And of course, we have to build in flexibility in there. And of course, there'll still be a role for oil and gas, because at the moment we can't get to...
But that's a point you touched on. That's a bugbear for us, because oil and gas has all the expertise you need. It's very usable in renewable, yet the government just doesn't want to hear about oil and gas.
I think Britain needs a lot more energy overall. And more of that, a higher proportion of that will come from renewables. We really do need to get on with nuclear as well. The other part of the equation as to have a zero carbon or very, very low carbon base load capability which nuclear provides. So I think the government, the way I looked at it is more like when your energy generation, which of course is only one part of the problem, the UK needs to do a lot more on transmission and other things.
And efficiency. Yeah.
But I think on energy generation, I looked at it more like as if you're a portfolio manager. You needed a diversity of energy sources. Oil and gas will inevitably decline and should decline. But that's not the same as eliminating oil and gas. And you definitely want to build your other capabilities before you start winding down your oil and gas. The UK, I think, has sensibly moved out of coal.
That's been a big success, yeah.
And it's been a big success. I think only about 15 years ago, about half of our electricity generation or thereabouts came from coal. It's now very, very close to zero.
I think it is zero. The last one just shut down.
Yes. I think that is a big success. And whatever you think about these people who talk about net zero as an ideology or zealotry and whatever else, you've got to ask them. I mean, my air quality question, I think, is a really good question. I've spent most of my adult life in London. I really think the air quality is obviously still not perfect. It's got a long way to go, but it's not just about hitting a target on a piece of paper. It's not just about the global climate. It's also about our local environment as well. I think that's the way to help sell it.
I think, in summary, our members want to go down that route, but obviously the investment is still going into the traditional fossil fuel type sectors at the moment. So the FID data we have on the EIC database is showing it going in the wrong way at the moment. So hopefully that will improve as we go forward. Yeah. Final serious question. You were chairman of the Conservative Party for a while.
I was.
What is happening with it? I hear it's so poor now, it might be having to move out of its head office. What's going on? Is it just being in opposition is just hard work and not so glamorous as it was in power?
It is hard work. I spent 5 years in opposition myself, 2005 to 2010. And that was the easier part of opposition, because those are the years where you felt you were coming out of opposition and you could well be going into government. And that's not really the feeling now. We've just come out of government after a long period of government. So I think it's a challenge. I think Kemi is doing a good job and deserves all of our support. When I say our support, I mean people like me in the Conservative Party. But it's tough out there. People turned against us very, very sharply from about 2022 onwards, and we got smashed back down 121 MPs. So I think it's difficult. The last time we were in this position was really 1997. It took us a long time to rebuild. I think Kemi is getting on with the job of rebuilding the party. She's doing the right thing by setting out principles today rather than policies. The policies of the election will be in 4 years' time. There could be a whole different set of issues. She's doing the right thing at the moment and deserves all of our support. One of the things that corroded support for the Conservative Party in recent years was too many changes at the top. You've already mentioned the 5 prime ministers. If you were running a company and you'd had 5 CEOs,
be unhappy.
They would be thinking this is a company in trouble. And it probably would be. That's a sure sign. So I think people thought this is a party that's in trouble. They can't sort of agree amongst themselves why a vote for somebody who is fighting the whole time. So we definitely don't want any more infighting. I think we need people to rally behind Kemi. She's the elected leader of the party, and I think is actually approaching the job in the right way.
So Arnold Schwarzenegger would say, I will be back. And you're saying you will be back, right?
Yeah, I think the Conservative Party definitely will be back. If you look at the history of the Conservative Party, every couple of generations, it gets a massive defeat. 1906, 1945, 1997, 2024. These are seminal moments in the history of the party where, we are, if you like, the natural party of government in the United Kingdom. And every generation, people say, we just had enough of these people. So we've just got to rebuild. But you rebuild a lot of hard work and rebuilding people's trust. And that's something you can't do in a few months. It takes years to rebuild people's trust. David Cameron did it. Margaret Thatcher did it. And it takes time.
Tony Blair did it for the Labour.
Definitely. Tony Blair did an amazing job to rebuild Labour's reputation as being a party that could even govern at all. Nobody really says Labour's the natural party of government. But his problem was that people were saying, looked at Labour as these people, you wouldn't want them running your corner shop, your home building project, let alone the country.
So finally, Greg, what's next for you? Is it a political book like Rory Stewart? Is it going to be maybe a children's author? How about Celebrity Get Me Out of Here, Strictly Come Dancing? Or is it something more serious for Greg?
That's a great question. I'm not really writing a classic book in that sense, but I am writing like a series of episodes. Because I've done, without blowing my own trumpet, quite a lot of very unusual things in my life that a lot of politicians haven't, for example. So I'm actually writing up a few things while my brain is still up for it. But I'm really looking to move into the private sector, do a sort of a third career. I haven't ruled out running again as a member of parliament, but I'm quite excited by opportunities that might be out there for doing a 10, 15-year stint. As my dad used to say, it's time to get a proper job.
A proper job. Well, with that, Greg, I want to say thank you very much. It's been fascinating and it's been great to meet up with you again. We had a good time when we worked in government, and I think we worked hard together. And I wish you all the best, and we hope to see you at EIC events in the future. Greg, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening. We would love to hear your thoughts. Share your comments on this episode and let us know what topics you'd like EIC to explore next. And for more insights like this, follow EIC on LinkedIn using the link in the description below. See you next time.